Why did the room fall silent the moment she spoke? Dust shook loose from the ceiling as another round of mortar fire slammed into the compound. The concrete wall behind her vibrated, flakes of stone peppering her shoulders like rain. Sarah Mitchell pressed her back into the shadow, breathing slow, measured, counting each inhale like it mattered, because it did. Everything did now. 6 operators down, 2 wounded bad, comms barely breathing through static. The extraction point, a smoking crater of crossed fire, was no longer an option. And somewhere far away, safe behind screens and polished tables, someone had decided she was the problem. The radio crackled, then his voice, Rear Admiral Dalton, sharp, controlled, cold. "I want Mitchell pulled out. Now, get someone competent to lead the extraction." Competent. The word didn't sting at first. It landed quietly, like it always had. Lieutenant Hayes glanced at her from across the rubble-strewn hallway. There was something in his eyes she'd learned to recognize early in her career. Pity. Not concern, not trust, just the quiet agreement that she was in over her head. For 72 hours, every call she'd made had been questioned. Every route suggestion brushed aside. Every hesitation treated as weakness instead of calculation. She was the only woman in the room, and that fact alone had been louder than her rank, her ribbons, her record. She closed her eyes for half a second as the memory surfaced uninvited. "No girls allowed," the general had said at the briefing days earlier, a smirk tugging at his mouth. "This is a Tier 1 operation, not a diversity photo shoot." Muted laughter, no objections, no correction. Silence had done what words didn't need to. Now the same voice wanted her gone. Sarah opened her eyes. The humiliation burned hot, but beneath it was something steadier, something colder. They didn't know who she was, not really. They saw restraint and called it weakness, silence and called it fear. They had no idea what she'd already survived, or what she was capable of when the rules stopped mattering. She keyed her radio but didn't answer, not yet. Because once she moved, there would be no going back. Why did she never tell them who she had been before the uniform? Sarah Mitchell had learned early how to disappear. As a kid, she was the quiet one, the girl teachers forgot to call on, the one who listened more than she spoke. At home, her father used words like fragile without realizing how deeply they sank in. "You're too soft for the real world," he'd said once, not angry, just certain. "You'll never survive where it matters." She joined the Navy to prove him wrong, or maybe to prove it to herself. She endured everything, training, exhaustion, pain, with her head down and her mouth shut. She believed discipline would earn respect, that humility would protect her, that if she followed every rule perfectly, she'd eventually belong. But even after the trident, even after the medals, she was still a question mark to them, a presence they tolerated instead of trusted. What they didn't know was that before the Navy, before Bud S., before the uniform gave her legitimacy, Sarah had lived somewhere far darker. For 3 years, she operated in places that didn't officially exist, contracted intelligence work, denied zones, missions that would never be briefed to Congress or mentioned in speeches, places where failure wasn't documented, it was buried. Mogadishu, Chechnya, borderland soaked in fear and rumor. She wasn't support, she wasn't backup. She was sent in when discretion mattered more than flags. She learned from men who never talked about their pasts. Delta, SAS. One Mossad instructor who taught her how violence actually worked, not the loud kind but the precise kind. She became fluent in patience, in angles, in knowing when to wait and when to end something decisively. 47 confirmed kills, no compromises, no mission failures. And she told no one. When she transitioned into the regular Navy, she buried that life. She wanted to earn her place cleanly. No shadows, no exceptions. She thought hiding her past would level the field. Instead, it erased her. And now, with the mission collapsing around her, she understood the cost of that silence. Why did she move before anyone could stop her? Mitchell, Dalton's voice snapped through the comms again. You are relieved of command. Acknowledge. She didn't. Hayes shifted uneasily. Sarah, maybe he's right, maybe I should. Stay in position, she said softly. Her voice didn't shake. That surprised even her. Then she moved. Not loudly, not dramatically. She slipped sideways through a fracture in the east wall, one the others hadn't noticed. Mortar fire had chewed the concrete just enough to open a narrow gap, barely wide enough, perfect for someone who didn't hesitate. Inside, the air smelled of cordite and sweat. Footsteps echoed down the corridor ahead. 3 hostiles, relaxed, overconfident. The first dropped before his brain registered motion. Suppressed shots. Clean. The second turned, confused, already too late. She closed the distance and ended it with a blade placed where armor didn't reach. The third fired wildly, panic replacing discipline. She redirected the barrel mid-shot, felt the recoil pass harmlessly, then drove him down. 12 seconds, silence restored. Her radio crackled with confusion. Where the hell is Mitchell? No answer. She descended the basement stairs like she'd done 100 times before in places that never made maps. 2 guards at the door, a flash of white, thunder. She entered through chaos, controlled bursts, practiced movement. The informant was alive, shaking, tied to a chair like he'd already accepted his fate. Can you walk? She asked. He nodded. Then move. They retraced her path just as fire erupted from above. Fighters repositioning. High ground, bad angles. She pushed the informant through the breach. Go, now. Then she turned back alone. Why did fear finally stop touching her? Hayes' voice broke through. Mitchell, you're outnumbered, get out of there. She didn't retreat. 6 tangos, she counted them automatically. Movement, timing, aggression. She advanced when they expected her to fall back. It broke their rhythm. Columns became cover. Bursts stayed controlled. One down, then another. Reload forward. She closed the distance until it wasn't a firefight anymore. It was personal. A rifle butt, a knee, 2 shots, 3. Silence fell again. Informant secured, she said calmly into the radio. Prepare to extract. There was stunned silence on the other end. But the sky wasn't done with them. Tracer fire stitched the air as the helicopter took hits. A technical on the ridge. Heavy gun. 800 meters. Bad wind. We need air support, Hayes said, desperation thick. We need 30 seconds, Sarah replied. She dropped to one knee, pulling the sniper rifle free. The world narrowed, breath, wind, elevation. She remembered a blizzard in Chechnya, a shot no one else would take. She squeezed. The ridge went quiet. The helicopter stabilized. And for the first time, no one questioned her. Why did recognition feel heavier than victory? Back at base, Dalton waited. His expression had changed. Less certain, less sure of himself. I've reviewed your footage, he said, and your full record, the real one. She met his gaze. I was wrong, he admitted. The words landed differently than she expected. Not triumphant, just relieving. Later, alone in the barracks, Sarah stared at the trident on her chest. She thought about how long she tried to earn permission to exist in rooms that never intended to give it. She understood something then. Belonging isn't granted. It's revealed. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why did the memory surface now, of all moments, when the walls were shaking and the radio wouldn't stop screaming her name? Sarah Mitchell pressed her helmet against the concrete and forced herself to breathe. Not because she was panicking, because control had always been her anchor. Around her, the compound felt like it was exhaling its last breath, steel groaning, dust clouds rolling through hallways, distant shouts in a language she didn't need to understand to recognize intent. Violence had its own dialect. She learned that long before she ever wore this uniform. The radio crackled again. Someone was shouting coordinates. Someone else was bleeding. Somewhere a man was praying under his breath. And through it all, that earlier moment kept replaying. The briefing room, fluorescent lights, clean floors, the general's voice sharp with certainty as his eyes lingered on her just a second too long. No girls allowed. She hadn't reacted then. She never did. She learned that reactions fed people like him. Silence unsettled them more. But silence also had a cost. It meant swallowing words that could have changed everything. Now she wondered how many of those men bleeding in the dust would still be standing if she hadn't swallowed them. She pushed the thought away. Regret was a luxury. Action was currency. Sarah shifted her weight and scanned the corridor again. She could hear the enemy regrouping, not rushing, coordinating. That worried her more than chaos ever did. Disorganized fighters made mistakes. Organized ones adapted. Her comms hissed. "Mitchell, where are you?" Hayes' voice again, less confident now, strained. "Command wants you out." "Out?" The word echoed strangely, as if she'd ever really been in. She didn't respond. Instead, she moved. Her boots barely made a sound as she slid through the breach, the concrete scraping her shoulder. Inside the compound, the air felt heavier, thicker, like it resisted movement itself. She paused just long enough to listen. 3 heartbeats, 3 sets of footsteps. The cadence told her everything. Armed, alert, but not expecting resistance from this direction. She didn't feel anger as she engaged them, or fear, just clarity. Afterward, when the corridor fell silent again, she leaned briefly against the wall, eyes closed. Not from exhaustion, from memory. Mogadishu had smelled like this. Heat, metal, panic. She'd been younger then, leaner, still learning how to quiet the part of herself that wanted to feel something afterward. She opened her eyes and moved on. The basement stairs creaked under her weight. At the bottom, the informant sat bound, eyes wide with disbelief when he saw her. He hadn't expected salvation to come quietly. Most people didn't. As she cut him loose, her hands were steady, but inside something twisted. This was the part they never saw. The part where you looked another human being in the eye and carried their fear with you for the rest of your life. The part where survival wasn't about marksmanship or tactics, but responsibility. She got him moving just as gunfire erupted above. Too close, too coordinated. She shoved him toward the exit. "Run." When she turned back, she felt it then. Not fear, not doubt. Resolve. The fighters above had the high ground. They thought that meant control. They didn't know what she knew, that proximity erased hierarchy. That at close range, experience mattered more than numbers. She advanced instead of retreating, watched confusion ripple through them as she broke their expectations. One went down hard. Another hesitated just long enough to make a fatal mistake. The rest tried to recover, but momentum was already gone. When it was over, her chest rose and fell slowly. Controlled, she keyed her radio. Informant secured. Silence answered her, then disbelief. As she guided the informant toward extraction, the night erupted again, this time from above. Tracer rounds arced through the sky, ripping into the helicopter as it struggled to hold position. The sound of metal tearing was unmistakable. Her jaw tightened. This was the moment that separated luck from loss. She dropped, unslinging the rifle with practiced ease. The distance was extreme, the wind unpredictable, the technical on the ridge barely visible through smoke and chaos. "You can't make that shot," Hayes said, his voice thin. She didn't argue. Arguing wasted breath. Her world narrowed. Numbers replaced noise, elevation, windage, breath. She remembered another night years ago, lying prone in freezing rain, waiting for a target that never came. Patience had been the lesson then. Now it was precision. She fired. The ridge went quiet. The helicopter steadied. Only then did she allow herself to exhale. Inside the aircraft later, no one spoke. No one joked. The usual rituals were gone. Every pair of eyes kept drifting back to her, not with skepticism now, but something heavier, something closer to awe, and maybe shame. She didn't meet their stares. She watched the horizon instead, the dark stretching endlessly ahead. Recognition felt strange, uncomfortable. She'd spent years wanting it, and now that it hovered just within reach, it felt incomplete. Because respect gained through crisis was still respect delayed. Back at base, the general waited. His posture was rigid, controlled, but the contempt was gone. "I've reviewed everything," he said, "your full record." She nodded once. "I was wrong." The words hung between them, not absolution, not justice, just acknowledgement. Later, alone in the barracks, Sarah sat on the edge of her bunk, helmet resting at her feet. The room was quiet, too quiet. Her hands trembled slightly now that nothing demanded their steadiness. She thought about the girl she'd been, the one told she was too soft, the one who believed silence was safety. She understood now what silence had cost her. Belonging wasn't something you earned by shrinking. It came when you stopped apologizing for taking up space. And as exhaustion finally claimed her, one truth settled deep and immovable. She had never needed permission, only the courage to stop hiding. If you want, I can continue part 3 immediately, deepening the aftermath, the internal reckoning, and the long shadow this mission leaves on Sarah's identity and future. Why did the silence after the mission feel heavier than the firefight itself? Sarah Mitchell woke before dawn, the way she always did after an operation. Not from noise, not from nightmares, from stillness. The kind that pressed against her chest and reminded her that something inside had shifted, whether she was ready for it or not. The barracks were dark, illuminated only by a thin strip of moonlight slipping through the window. Somewhere down the hall a door creaked. Someone coughed in their sleep. Ordinary sounds, safe sounds. And yet her body stayed tense, muscles locked in readiness, as if the walls might start shaking again at any second. She sat up slowly, boots touching the cold floor. Her hands were steady now, but her chest felt tight. That always came later, after the adrenaline faded, after the mission ended and the questions began. They all knew now. Not everything, not the full weight of what she'd carried before the Navy, but enough. Enough to change how they looked at her, enough to rewrite the story they'd already decided about who she was. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. At breakfast, the room shifted when she entered. Conversations dulled. Forks paused halfway to mouths. It wasn't hostility anymore. It was caution. Like people didn't know which version of her they were allowed to acknowledge, the quiet officer they dismissed, or the operator who had saved them when everything collapsed. Hayes caught her eye from across the table. He stood, hesitated, then walked over. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. She nodded. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The clatter of trays and muted chatter filled the gap. "I should have backed you," he said finally. "In the briefing, on the ground, all of it." She studied him. He looked tired, older than he had a day ago. Combat did that, truth did it faster. "You didn't," she replied calmly. Not accusing, just factual. He swallowed. "I know." Silence again, different this time, less sharp. "I didn't trust you," he admitted, "and I didn't even realize how much of that was about everything else." Sarah looked down at her hands, scarred, calloused, honest. "Most people don't," she said. Hayes nodded once. "I'm trying to learn." It wasn't an apology wrapped in poetry. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. She respected that. After he left, she finished her meal alone. The food tasted like nothing. Later that morning, the debrief began. Senior command filled the room. Screens lit up with satellite imagery, helmet cam footage frozen on moments she barely remembered experiencing. There she was, moving through smoke, clearing hallways, kneeling with the rifle steady as stone. It felt strange watching herself from the outside, detached, almost unreal. Rear Admiral Dalton stood at the front, hands clasped behind his back. His voice was measured, professional, but there was an undercurrent there now, something restrained. "The mission succeeded against overwhelming odds," he said. "Lives were saved due to decisive action under extreme pressure." He paused. The room followed his gaze as it landed on her. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell's actions were exceptional. Exceptional. The word rippled softly through the room. She didn't react. Praise had never been her fuel, survival had been. After the briefing, Dalton asked her to stay behind. When the door closed, the room felt smaller. "I won't pretend an apology fixes everything," he said, "but I need you to understand something. I didn't doubt your skill because of your record. I doubted it because of my assumptions." She waited, let him sit with it. "That won't happen again," he added. "Not with you, not with anyone under my command." She met his eyes. "It already happened," she said quietly. "The question is what you do next time." He nodded slowly. "Fair." When she left the room, the weight on her shoulders felt different. Not gone, just redistributed. That afternoon, she found herself alone on the range. She hadn't planned it. Her body had simply carried her there, muscle memory guiding her steps. The familiar smell of oil and dust grounded her. She loaded a magazine, raised her weapon, and fired. Each shot landed clean, center mass controlled. But her thoughts drifted anyway. She remembered the first time she'd taken a life. Not in this uniform, not with this clarity. She'd been younger, less certain. The instructor beside her had said, "If you hesitate, you die. If you overthink, someone else pays." She learned fast. What she'd never learned was how to be seen afterward. That night she sat alone again, this time by choice. She thought about the girl who'd stayed silent to survive rooms like the one she'd stood in yesterday. The woman who believed humility meant invisibility. The operator who'd learned to bury her truth because it was easier than fighting for it. She realized something then. Strength wasn't just what she did under fire. It was what she allowed herself to claim afterward. The next mission would come, it always did. Different location, different enemy, same risks, but something fundamental had changed. They would never underestimate her again. And neither would she. Because resilience wasn't about enduring dismissal forever. Sometimes, it was about standing long enough for the world to be forced to look at you clearly. And once it did, there was no unseeing you. Why did the recognition feel like a weight she hadn't trained to carry? Sarah Mitchell stood alone on the flight line, the wind tugging at her sleeves, the sky washed pale with early morning light. Aircraft moved in the distance, routine, efficient, indifferent. Life continuing as if nothing monumental had happened. And maybe that was the problem. The world didn't pause just because something inside her had cracked open. Since the debrief, her name had traveled faster than she ever had. Whispers in hallways, side glances, a few awkward nods from officers who'd never bothered to learn her name before. Recognition followed her like a shadow she hadn't invited. She wanted respect once, thought it would feel like relief. Instead, it felt like exposure. In the quiet moments, doubt crept in. Not about her ability, but about the cost. She'd spent years controlling how much of herself she allowed the world to see. Now that control was slipping, and with it came an unfamiliar vulnerability. A maintenance crew passed by. One of them saluted, instinctively, respectfully. She returned it, then stood there a moment longer, unsettled by how ordinary the exchange looked from the outside. If they only knew what it had taken. Later that day, she was summoned again, this time not for a reprimand or review but for a ceremony. Small, internal, no cameras, no speeches meant for public consumption, just command staff and those who had been there. She almost didn't go. Sitting in the back row, she felt the old reflex return, the urge to shrink, to disappear into the background. But when her name was called, she stood, walked forward, accepted the recognition with a nod that revealed nothing. Applause filled the room, polite, earnest. It washed over her without sinking in. Because applause couldn't reach the places still haunted by memory. That night sleep refused to come. The ceiling above her bunk blurred as her thoughts spiraled inward, not to the mission itself, but to everything before it. Every moment she'd chosen silence over challenge. Every time she'd been overlooked and convinced herself it didn't matter. She wondered who she might have been if she'd spoken sooner. The thought lingered uncomfortably. She found herself back at the water's edge later, watching the tide move with patient inevitability. It reminded her of something an old instructor once told her during a rare moment of honesty. "You can survive almost anything," he'd said, "but if you don't decide who you are afterward, the world will do it for you." At the time she hadn't understood, now she did. The next mission briefing came sooner than expected. Different theater, different threat profile, same room, same long table, but this time the atmosphere shifted the moment she entered. Eyes turned, conversation stopped. Dalton gestured for her to take a seat near the front. As the plan unfolded, she listened, really listened, not just to the words but to the spaces between them. She saw the flaw almost immediately, a narrow window, a risk no one else wanted to name. She felt the old hesitation rise, the instinct to wait, to let someone else speak first. Then she remembered the cost of that waiting. "There's a problem with the approach vector," she said. The room stilled. She explained calmly, clearly, no defensiveness, no apology, just facts. This time no one laughed. Questions followed, real ones, clarifying ones, adjustments were made, the plan changed. It wasn't dramatic, no one applauded. But when the briefing ended, she felt something settle into place inside her. Belonging didn't arrive with fanfare. It arrived when her voice no longer felt borrowed. Later, Hayes caught up with her outside the room. "You were right," he said, again. She offered a small nod. "We all want to get home." That night she wrote a message she'd been avoiding for years, short, unpolished, honest. To her father: "I'm not soft. I never was. I just learned strength differently." She didn't know if he'd understand, or if he'd respond at all, but for the first time she didn't need his validation to mean it. As the base settled into sleep, Sarah lay awake, not restless this time but reflective. She wasn't chasing redemption anymore. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was deciding what parts of herself to protect, what parts to share, and what kind of leader she intended to be. Because strength wasn't only forged in fire. Sometimes it was shaped in the quiet moments afterward, when no one was watching and the hardest battle was choosing not to disappear again. Why did the next call come when she had finally learned how to breathe again? The alarm didn't scream. It chimed, low, restrained, almost polite. That was how she knew it mattered. Sarah Mitchell was already awake when it sounded, staring at the dark ceiling, counting breaths she didn't need to regulate anymore. For the first time in years, sleep hadn't come with ghosts. No gunfire looping behind her eyes. No frozen moments she couldn't outrun. She swung her legs off the bunk and stood steady. Not hurried, not tense. Ready. The briefing room filled faster than usual. The mood was different too, quieter, heavier. No bravado, no jokes. The kind of silence that came when everyone sensed the margin for error was thin. Dalton stood at the head of the table, but he wasn't leading this one. He nodded toward Sarah instead. "Lieutenant Commander Mitchell will walk us through it." The room didn't react. That was the difference. No surprise, no resistance, just attention. The mission was small on paper. A reconnaissance and recovery op in a contested border zone. One asset down, alive if the intel was right. The kind of mission that went unnoticed, unless it failed. As Sarah spoke, she felt the familiar clarity settle in. Terrain, timing, exit routes, but beneath the tactical rhythm something else stirred. Responsibility. Not the kind tied to rank, the kind tied to people. She noticed it when she paused, not to think but to listen, to the questions, to the concerns that hadn't been voiced before. She adjusted the plan in real time, not to assert control but to create trust. This wasn't about proving anything. This was about bringing everyone home. On the ground, the night pressed close, too quiet. The team moved in controlled formation, each step deliberate. Sarah took point, not because she needed to, but because it made sense. She caught herself checking on them more than usual. A glance, a nod, a subtle hand signal that said, "I see you." Halfway through the approach, everything shifted. A distant sound, not gunfire, not yet. Engines. Her pulse didn't spike, it slowed. "Hold," she whispered. They froze. The asset was closer than expected, so was the enemy. A miscalculation, hers, small, correctable, but real. The old Sarah would have shouldered it silently, adjusted alone, taken the risk herself. This time she didn't. "We changed the approach," she said quietly. "Now." No one questioned it. They moved as one. But the delay cost them time. The window narrowed. The extraction zone grew hotter by the minute. When contact finally came, it was chaotic, close, messy. A man went down hard, not dead but pinned. Panic flared sharp and immediate. Sarah was already moving. She dragged him to cover, bullets chewing the dirt inches away. Her heart hammered, not with fear but with urgency, not for herself. For him. "Stay with me," she said, pressing a hand to his shoulder. "You're not done yet." She coordinated fire, controlled the retreat. Her voice stayed level even as the world fractured around them. They made it to the extraction point with seconds to spare. On the flight out, the injured operator clenched her sleeve weakly. "You didn't leave me," he said, barely audible. She met his eyes. "I won't." Back at base, the adrenaline drained slowly. No ceremony this time, no speeches, just exhausted bodies and quiet gratitude. Later, alone again, Sarah sat on the edge of her bunk, hands resting on her knees. She thought about leadership, about strength, about the difference between surviving and staying. She realized then that her redemption hadn't come when they finally saw her. It came when she stopped needing them to. Because true resilience wasn't about enduring dismissal or earning respect through pain. It was about choosing, every day, to stand fully in who you are, and using that strength to carry others when they can't carry themselves. She lay back and closed her eyes. For the first time, she slept without waiting for the next alarm. Why did peace arrive so quietly, without ceremony or witnesses? The base was still when Sarah Mitchell stepped outside just before dawn. The kind of stillness that only exists in places built for violence but momentarily free of it. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of fuel and dust, and the sky was beginning to lighten at the edges, unsure of itself. She stood there for a long moment, hands in her pockets, listening. No alarms. No radios crackling with urgency. No one calling her name. For years, silence had meant danger, a pause before chaos. Now it felt like permission. She thought about how many versions of herself had existed to get her here. The quiet girl who learned to disappear. The young operative who learned to endure. The officer who believed respect came from compliance. The leader who finally understood that strength didn't need to announce itself. They weren't separate people, just layers, all of them still inside her. Footsteps approached behind her. She didn't turn right away. "Couldn't sleep either?" Hayes asked softly. "Didn't need to," she replied. They stood side by side, watching the horizon. No tension this time. No unfinished words pressing between them. "I used to think leadership meant never showing doubt," he said after a while. "Now I think it means knowing when to listen." She nodded, and knowing when not to disappear. He smiled faintly at that. Then, respectful as always now, he left her to the quiet. Later that morning, Dalton addressed the unit, not from a podium, not with prepared remarks, just a few words spoken plainly. "We're changing how we measure people," he said, "not by how loud they are, not by how familiar they look, but by how they act when it matters." His eyes found Sarah's. He inclined his head slightly, not as a superior, as an acknowledgement. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt settled. Days passed. Routine returned, training, maintenance. Briefings that ended on time. The world, indifferent and steady, kept moving. One evening, she finally received a message she hadn't expected to see. From her father. "I was wrong. I didn't understand you. But I see you now." She read it twice, then once more. Her throat tightened, but she didn't cry. Not because she couldn't, but because she didn't need to. The words weren't closure. They were something quieter. Release. That night she walked to the range one last time before lights out. Not to train, just to stand there, to remember who she'd been, to acknowledge who she was becoming. She realized then that her story didn't end with medals or recognition. It didn't hinge on proving anyone wrong. It ended and began again with choice. The choice to lead without bitterness, to remember without being ruled by memory, to exist fully without shrinking. When the next generation came through, young, uncertain, watching everything, she would be ready, not to harden them, not to test them for worthiness, but to show them what quiet strength looked like. As the lights dimmed across the base, Sarah Mitchell returned to her quarters. She removed the trident from her uniform and set it carefully on the table, not as a symbol of conquest, but of responsibility. She lay down, hands folded, breathing slow. Some battles are loud. Some victories are visible. But the ones that matter most happen inside. When a person finally stops asking for permission to exist. Because dignity doesn't argue. It doesn't demand. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak at all. It simply acts.